course, continue talking about lecture-wise on the French Revolution. Of course, I'm going to get more into the outbreak, of course, of the revolution itself today. Of course, it's the same pretty much lecture platform, PowerPoint platform I had before for you that I have overall, which is right there. So I'll blow it up for you so you can see it more or less. Now, I need to get into, of course, talking about the outbreak, like how the revolution broke out, which I guess officially the revolution starts on July the 14th, 1789. But kind of get into like what caused, one of the things that caused it the most, if you know much about it. I told you about all the high debts that France owed, which a lot of it was, due to the American Revolution, that they had spent money on trying to fight the British, to get back at the British, all that. And apparently they needed to raise taxation. There wasn't enough money to pay for all the debts they owed. The nobility didn't really want to raise taxes. So they forced the king to call what they call the Estates General. And they usually call it the Estates General of 1789, I think is what they kind of give it a nickname. And the States General, what was it? Well, States General, it's been around a while, off and on. It originally was founded in medieval France. I think the king was, I want to say King Philip IV had created it a long time ago. But under, I think, Louis XIII, they had closed it down. So it didn't really exist anymore. And basically, the States General was like an advisory body to the king that represented all the three estates, or the estates of the realm that we talked about, which were the clergy, the nobility, and the common people. And it wasn't really like a parliament like in Britain. It was more like a advisory body, mostly on physical things like financial stuff that they advise the king on, and that's about it, which, pretty much. And so what happened was they eventually elected delegates to it. I think in 1788, they started electing people, which I think would be around 1,200 or so delegates that would be elected to it eventually, which I think half of them were like lawyers, if you read about it. And eventually they met in the spring of 1789, I think around May when it started. And one of the first things that started the whole revolution, if you really read about it, is that the king and his advisors and all that, and then of course the third estate and some of the other estates couldn't decide on how they needed to vote in the election or in this assembly, so that became a major issue, in the whole thing. And it was like the whole thing was like the third estate mostly, which was made up of most of the common people wanted to vote by head, vote by elected delegate, basically, which would actually give them more votes. I think the third estate had like 610 votes or 610 people in it. And I think the rest, what was the other one? I think the second and first estates had about 590 men or so. So it would have, given them like an advantage. And then, of course, the other one, which is the king, of course, and his advisors and all that, they wanted to vote by estate, which would, give obviously the first, second estates, upper class kind of an advantage, which they would be able to basically outvote people, 2-1, pretty much. Where's that coming in? Now, of course, what happened, one of the most famous things that, of course, happened at the beginning of the French Revolution, right before when it broke out, was a man named Abbé Sieyès. His full name is actually Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. He was a member of the First Estate. He published a pamphlet that became known as "What is the Third Estate?" It kind of became like a manifesto of the revolution, if you want to call it that. And in this publication, which came out like right before the States General met, it basically attacked the upper classes as having, too much power, too many privileges and rights, because the common people didn't have any really say or anything, no rights or anything like that. And what Abbé Sieyès wants is he wants the third estate to become like a real assembly, a real democratic type assembly, kind of like in Britain, like the parliament. And so he thought that what they ought to do is form this assembly, because most of France was made up of predominantly the common people. Forget what the percentage was exactly, but most people that were in the third estate was like 90-something percent of the people. So very few people were actually in the first, second estates. Oh, what is the third estate is famous for having a bunch of questions it asked, I think, in it. So I think there's a slide on that I believe I've got. If I could find, I don't know if that one's in there about, yeah, there it is. What is the third estate? Yeah, I've got them right there. I've actually have the full one if you want, right here on the bottom, which is what is the third, well, I'll get to that in a second, but it's right here. What is the third estate? Everything, of course. What has it been politically until now? It's a variation of it. Nothing. And what does it demand, or what does it want to be? Something. Pretty much is the other one. So pretty simple about that. And so that would kind of, in a sense, later, it's going to eventually make absolutism obsolete. That's what they're kind of coming to at this point. And so one of the first things that happened to really cause the revolution to really start politically overall is the National Assembly decided to the Third Estate decided to break away and form their own assembly. So they break away, and they were actually going to go meet in their meeting room at Versailles, but the king locked them out, wouldn't let them meet. He said he was gonna do something to the room and paint it, and he was going to give a speech there, I think he said, or something. I don't know if it's probably not true, but so they decided to go to this indoor tennis court. I think they call it a squash court, I think is what it really was. And so on the date of June the 17th, they all met there. And some of them were like mostly third estate delegates, and then some from the first, second estate also met with them too, as well, that wanted to, because they invited them to come too, some of those members. And they formed this new assembly that was called, they call it different names. National Assembly is the common name. I think they also called it the National Constituent Assembly, but they dropped the constituent part. So it became known as National Assembly. And so the National Assembly became really the first true democratic assembly that they have. So they think that's the initial political thing that really, starts the revolution at that point. And so the king, was trying to get them to disband and all that. And of course they, wouldn't do it and all that. Then a few days later, what happened next, they then all took an oath. All the delegates that were part of this new assembly came in there. They took an oath, which became known as the tennis court oath. They took an oath basically to create a constitution for France. France didn't have one. It was an absolute monarchy. The king was the constitution, I guess, if you want to call it that. And so they consider that to be one of the big sparks that really starts the revolution by basically doing this. And of course, they later made famous paintings of it. I don't know if you heard of the famous painter, French painter named French artist named Jacques-Louis David. He paints a lot of paintings of the French Revolution and Age of Napoleon and all that. And that's really one of his famous paintings that depicts all of the members of the National Assembly taking an oath there. And I think the guy that's in white right here, looks like he's wearing kind of a habit of a clergyman or something like that. That's Abbé Sieyès, one of the guys. He's one of the first revolutionaries that's really involved in the whole thing. Gets it going, he's around a while. Abbé Sieyès. They called him Abbé because he was at one point a abbot. You know what that is, which heads up a monastery, basically like a monk. And so they all take an oath. There's a slide here you can see which talks about what the oath actually was. Yeah, there's about 578 men that actually took the oath and signed it. It said the National Assembly, considering that it has been summoned to establish the Constitution of the Kingdom, decrees that all members of this assembly shall immediately take a solemn oath not to separate until the Constitution of the Kingdom is established on the firm foundations. So they all took an oath to basically eventually write a constitution, more or less. So that's the really beginning stage, of the whole revolution with the National Assembly forming and the tennis court oath overall. All right, now the next thing that happens, of course, after that, you then have the famous storming of the Bastille. That's the other thing that happened in the outbreak, of course, of the Revolution, French Revolution. And, of course, the storming of the Bastille happened on July 14th, 1789. And after the National Assembly formed, there was kind of a worry that the king was going to basically stop all the reforms. And there was an incident that happened right before that, which I'll mention right here. They think it was stormed due to the fact that Jacques Necker, I don't know if you know who he was a French-Swiss minister, finance minister that was under Louis XVI. He was seen as one of the very few in Louis XVI's government that seemed like he was more pro-reform minded, seemed like more of a champion of the people. And Necker wanted tax reform, where taxes would be more equal, in that the lower classes wouldn't have to pay as much tax, because the upper classes, like the clergy, nobility, weren't paying a lot of tax, very little. It was all being put on the third estate, and all that. And so what happened was he got fired. And so they're thinking, hey, since he got fired, it looks like the revolution, might be stopped. Also, the king started bringing up troops that surrounded Paris and Versailles. And so people really started worrying about that. And so on that date of July 14th, 1789, the Bastille was stormed. What exactly was the Bastille? The Bastille was a famous French political prison. It's mostly where a lot of political prisoners went to, like Voltaire, I think at one point was put in the Bastille, I think twice. I don't know if you heard of Marquis de Sade. I think he was in prison there. A few other guys. Was it Dennis Diderot? One of those guys I think was in prison too, I thought, in there. One of those philosophes I know was also in there at one point as well. It was also an armory. They had weapons and guns and stuff in it. And I think it had about 30,000 pounds of gunpowder in it, 15 cannon, 30,000 muskets were inside of it, 15,000 cartridges as well for the muskets. So, yeah, obviously they wanted to get the weapons, to fight against their own regime here. And they think that the Bastille, if you know about it, became a symbol of tyranny, the symbol of absolutism, of the Bourbon regime, of the ancient regime. And so it kind of became a fight between the citizens and the guards that were guarding it. There was actually this guy named Marquis de Launay. He was actually the governor of the Bastille, one of the first men killed in the Revolution. He had about 114 guardsmen that were guarding it. They got overwhelmed by the mobs of people, attacking the Bastille. I think some of the soldiers even switched sides. They didn't want to kill their own people. And so Launay, he was killed. He killed a few other men, I think, after that. And they started taking people's heads, cutting them off, and putting them on pikes. And then later, after they stormed the Bastille, they famously tore it down by brick by brick. The people did. They tore it down. And today it's not there. It's not like a park there now in Paris. But it was torn down right after. Now, so that's really, if you think about, the whole, revolution, the pretty much the Bastille being stormed is the violent spark of the revolution really gets violent at that point. Because this point, it's like political change at that point with what the National Assembly is doing at Versailles. And then all of a sudden, it just blows up and becomes a violent revolution. It was a very bloody revolution, the French Revolution, which would last about 10 years. From 1789 to 1799, they kind of went through revolution. And France would have even more revolutions, I think, that would follow in the 1800s as well. Of course, France today, as you know, I think I've got a slide on this to show you. France today, of course, now celebrates what they call Bastille Day. Of course, July 14th every year. It's like a national day of remembrance, I guess. Kind of like our July 4th holiday in the United States, but it's kind of celebrating the date that they kind of start to overthrow absolutism or despotism in the country. It was made a official national holiday in France in 1880. You can see by Benjamin Raspail, and so that was basically something that they did later. That was when the French state went to like a republic later again. So that was like the beginning of the revolution, at that point. They, of course, had a lot of paintings, depicting the Bastille. Like here's another one. There's been all kinds of paintings, of course, of that being, of course, occurring. Now, of course, let's get into like the beginning of the revolution, more or less. The revolution kind of goes through different stages. Like the early part of the revolution, it's kind of a moderate stage, if you want to call it that. I don't know if it's really the term to use for it. Because they have like the radical phase that's later, they got the moderate stage and they got the reign of terror, which was more radical a little later. They have. First thing that happened after the Bastille was stormed, they had what they call the Great Fear that happened in France. This is where the revolution spread throughout the whole country. Everybody got involved. People that like the nobility, a lot of the upper classes actually fled the country, left if they weren't put in prison or killed by the revolutionaries. And the peasants also got involved too, which created a lot of mass hysteria and panic throughout the country. In fact, a lot of these peasants formed these mobs of peasants. They were called brigands. They went around the country attacking like noblemen's manors and burning them down, attacking or killing, nobility, etc. So yeah, this complete panic, rioting, basically across the whole country, more or less. Then they also had the so-called Women's March. I don't know if you ever heard about that, the Women's March, but women marched on with the Women's March. They marched on women marched on the Palace of Versailles. Happened in early October of 1789. There was of course, I told you all the shortages of food, high-priced food. They talked about the little short video I showed you at the beginning, people not having enough food as examples. And they actually stormed the Palace of Versailles. The people that really broke into it stormed the gates and inside of it. And I think they actually stormed into it. And I think they stormed actually into the actual bedchamber of Queen Marie Antoinette, hacked up her bed, literally. They almost killed her too, tried to. But they had Marquis de Lafayette. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was a famous French general. He intervened and talked them into not killing them. Although a lot of their guards were. A lot of the guards who were protecting the king and the queen were massacred. They put their heads on pikes. And they forced the king and queen to go back to Paris and live there. And so Louis XVI was the last king to rule from Versailles. Because after that, it becomes like a museum now. So 1789 was basically when, of course, that would end. So that was the so-called Women's March they had at that point. Then, because of all the rioting and the panicking going on with the peasants, all the stuff they're doing, and all of that, the National Assembly decides to step in, and they start making a lot of reforms to the country. And of course, one of the main things that they issue is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which was passed around August of 1789. These were actually a part of a bunch of reforms that were sometimes called the August Decrees that came out. And a lot of these abolished, like, the rights of the nobility, the rights of the clergy, and so on, privileges that they had in the country and all that. It basically got rid of serfdom. So no more serfdom anymore, which they still kind of had in France at the time. They got rid of tithes or tithing. It's where, like, everybody had to pay a lot of money to the church. So they got rid of that. So that was one of the things that a lot of the lower classes hated, like the peasants. They were having to pay a lot of taxes to the upper class, nobility and all that, king and the church. And the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, what that did was it gave everybody, at least all Frenchmen anyway, equal rights throughout the country. Liberty, property, security, you can see there, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, etc. They believed that the Declaration of the Rights of Man was a document that was heavily influenced by a combination of maybe the Declaration of Independence, the United States. They think maybe it was influenced by the English Bill of Rights. In fact, they think that Declaration of Rights of Man may have been influenced by Thomas Jefferson. I think there's a theory that he may have, I don't know if Ghost wrote it or whatever, but may have put some influence into it. They think it was mostly written by Marquis de Lafayette. I think it was the guy that actually wrote it. And I think it came out, I want to say August 27th, 1789, I think is when they eventually published it or whatever. So these are all the reforms they're making to the country at that point. Also, the French at that point start adopting some things that's famous about the revolution, if you know much about it. The slogan of the French Revolution became liberty, equality, fraternity. Or sometimes they'll say brotherhood instead of fraternity. So liberty, equality, fraternity. And then they started wearing these you may have seen this. Look, I don't know if you saw in the little short video. If you missed that, go back and look at it again. They have these little cockades they wear, like either on their hat or on their shirt, which were blue, white, and red, which symbolized that, supposedly liberty, equality, fraternity. And that became, over time, the national flag of France starts to be adopted. If you go back up to that slide I had, shows you the tricolor flag. I'm trying to think if I have another picture of the tricolor flag. I think I do for some reason. But it's blue, white, and red. Those, of course, are the colors of the famous tricolor. There you go, tricolor flag, which, believe it or not, the colors blue and red represented the people, which they call the commune, and also the Paris Commune, which was a local Paris government that they established after they took over the revolution. Then the white was supposed to represent the king and the monarchy, which they kept later. Supposedly blue represented also liberty, and red represented maybe brotherhood or fraternity, and then white maybe represented equality. I don't know if that's really true or not. Some say it was as well. Also, the red part of the flag, of course, is supposedly where the communist flag came from. The red flag, you sometimes see, but it's a sickle and hammer on it. So, kind of talking about that. Here's another picture. Yeah, July 26th looks like actually is what it is. 26th or 27th, one of the two, when it actually came out. But so yeah, they start, and I don't think the flag itself became really the official flag until later. Like I want to say in the 1800s when they made it the official flag, but over time it does eventually occur. Now, the other thing that happened too at the beginning of the revolution was that the National Assembly also adopted a constitution, like their first one, which is called the Constitution of 1791, What it did was it created a constitutional monarchy, which was quite surprising. Most people thought that it would be like maybe a Republican government that they might want instead, but they didn't go with that. They think that they were influenced by the British model, and it had a unicameral assembly, which they called it eventually. They changed the name eventually to the Legislative Assembly, which it was around for like a short period, I think till 1792. It was only around for like a year or so, and then eventually it will get replaced by another assembly that's called the National Convention. It had most of the powers, like to create laws, taxation, like Parliament did in Britain, England. And the king's powers were limited. He couldn't do a whole lot. He had, ministers and advisors and stuff like that, but his powers were limited. And the only thing he really could do to stop the assembly, like the passage of laws or bills, whatever, was to have what they call a suspension veto that he had. So kind of like had a veto like a president had. But I think he only could suspend it for so long. And a lot of the French, like the revolutionaries anyway, involved in the whole thing, thought that his wife was his main advisor. Kind of joked about it, Marie Antoinette. And so they joked that his wife was Madame Veto. She would tell him to veto this and to veto that and stuff like that. Now, finally, what happened, which is well known at the beginning of the revolution, is that also one thing that happened too as well, which really led to the king being in disfavor with the French revolutionaries in the country, was that, if you know about it, he tried to flee the country, Louis XVI. Like in the summer of 1791, about June 1791, Louis XVI decided he had to get out of the country, like get out, like flee. Basically, with him and his wife and his family. They were going to flee to the Austrian Netherlands because, remember, Marie Antoinette is Austrian, to try to get military aid from Austria, Prussia, maybe some other countries to get his throne back because he's practically losing power at that point. And they get halfway to the border where the Netherlands is. And it's funny about the story about this, but they disguise themselves to try to, escape. And what they did was Louis and his wife and his kids all disguised themselves as the servants. And the servants dressed up like the king, I think, or something like that, like the royal family. Kind of weird how they did that. About halfway there, they got caught. And the reason why they got caught was somebody recognized his face, Louis XVI, from some paper money. Like, hey, that's the king. Where's he going? And so they got caught. They were seen as traitors after that of the revolution. So practically after that, they were put under house arrest. They actually would end up living in the what they call the Tuileries Palace, which is in the Louvre, or part of the Louvre. And pretty much they're there till eventually the monarchy is overthrown. Right. Now, the other thing that happened too with the Legislative Assembly, it got taken over by more radical factions that were in there. We'll kind of get more into the whole left-right political spectrum because it's something that kind of starts with the French Revolution as well. And the most notorious were the Jacobins, which I think I do have a slide on that one. The Jacobins, they're also called the Jacobin Club, that they were dubbed. There were different factions that were basically in it. They were called the Jacobin Club. They weren't a political party. That's what some people think, like Republican, Democrat or something like that. No, they weren't really a political party. There are various political factions that had supported the idea of the Constitution. I think originally the Jacobins were called the what was the name of them? They were called the Society of Friends of the Constitution. As they were dubbed, Society of Friends of the Constitution, and they had different factions that were in it. It doesn't really show you the different factions. They'll get to Maximilien Robespierre, who was one of their main leaders in a second. But the two main factions that were in it were the Girondins or Girondists. See, they call it either one. They were more like moderate, more in the center politically, to the left of the probably royalists, basically. And then you had the Montagnards, who were called the Mountain, or Mountain. Really, Montagnards means the Mountain Men, but they're called the Mountain. I'll explain why they call the Mountain later in a second. And of course, they had a very famous leader. He was a mayor of the Jacobins who was part of the Montagnards. His name was Maximilian Robespierre, and he had a nickname. He was called the Incorruptible because he supposes he couldn't be corrupted or something like that kind of deal. And Robespierre was a famous French politician, lawyer. He was, of course, later a dictator, because he would practically take over the country in 1793-94. I'll get to it later. He's the guy that would start the so-called Reign of Terror, which was the more radical phase of the revolution. And Robespierre later had a lot of people killed, like executed, those that were against the revolution. It was kind of like a attempt to stop counter-revolutions from happening in the country. And they were behind the idea of abolishing the monarchy. They wanted to get rid of it, get rid of the monarchy, and create like more of a Republican type government. And that's what eventually they'll try to go to. But of course, it'll be more of a dictatorship. And I'll get to later, they have this thing called the Committee of Public Safety that'll form. And it's like a dictatorship that basically runs the country. Wanted to mention one thing about this assembly and the French assembly and, of course, the French Revolution. You study much today about, the left-right political spectrum. You got people that are on the left that are liberal, right that are conservative. It all started with this assembly. So everybody that's on the left were either considered liberal or radical. So like your Montagnards, who were called the Mountain, sat on the left. They sat, by the way, high up on the left side. And so that's why they call them the Mountain, because they're high up above everybody else, basically. Then they had those that were in the center, either called centrists or they're called moderates. I'm probably more like somewhere in the middle or right of center somewhere politically, maybe me. But that would be like the Girondists. I think they were considered right. Yeah, center right. I think it's supposedly where they were, or somewhere around the center, Girondists. And then you got on the far to the right, you got those that are conservatives, ultra conservatives, those like the royalists and so on, ultra royalists, people like that or whatever. And I think they put fascism over there and stuff like that, if you know about that, to the far right. So basically where you sit, where you sat in the whole thing, it's spelled wrong, by the way, it should be where, well, I got spelled wrong, but basically where you sat, it's basically, where the political spectrum is left. And I guess it's still like that maybe in the, I don't know if it's like that. I think it's still like that in the U.S. Senate and all that assemblies a lot of times today overall. Now, what happened next, of course, if you know much about it, then, of course, the revolution starts to go radical, eventually, of course, under the Jacobins eventually take over the whole country. One of the first things that happens, of course, is the Tuileries Palace, by the way, where Louis XVI and his family's staying. It's actually stormed by the French revolutionaries. They accused the king and his wife of being against the revolution. Why? Well, they began to write to foreign countries, I think Austria first and then Prussia, to try to get military aid to come in to save his regime, which is starting to falter at this point. And so they stormed the palace and basically arrest him. Although I think Louis tried to flee to the assembly to try to get help, but they eventually arrest him. They imprison him. They imprisoned his family in this Templar fortress called the Temple. It's called, where they hold him, I think, until they're executed, both of them. And all of his Swiss guards that were guarding his family and all that, they were all massacred by the revolutionaries. They're all killed and all that. And so, like I said, the Jacobins basically seized control of the government at that point. They take over the country in 1792. they formed basically what is the first French Republic. So basically, they abolish the monarchy. They get rid of it at that point. They form a new assembly that's called the National Convention, which will control the country from 1792 to 1795. So that's kind of basically how that happens. How the French go from a monarchy to, of course, a republic. But the only thing about what happens with getting rid of the monarchy, this angers a lot of countries in Europe. Most countries in Europe have a monarchy, whether it be absolute or constitutional monarchy. And so the founding of the French Republic sparks what they call the French Revolutionary Wars, which last around 10 years, from 1792 to 1802. And so countries in Europe like Austria, you see Prussia, Russia, British Empire, Spanish, etc., all oppose France because they don't want the revolution to spread to their country, overthrow their monarch, etc. So they all begin basically taking up arms to try to stop the French Revolution and all of that. So that's basically the beginning of the revolution about that. And I think at one point they do try to invade, but in September of 1792 they have a miracle where I think it's Prussia and some other forces got beat at what is called the Battle of Valmy, Valmy, I think it's spelled. And so they halt, basically trying to stop it at that point. But yeah, the revolution will eventually will spread over time, throughout Europe, and even cause like Haiti to revolt because I think in 1794 the Jacobins abolished slavery, and so wherever the French have slavery, they basically revolted. Like the Haitian revolt, follows, and Haiti later becomes an independent country in the Caribbean later. Well, of course, with the Jacobins taking over, one of the big things that happens, is they have the so-called Reign of Terror happens. And the Reign of Terror was basically a period of political repression in France. It's been often compared to the Red Terror that happened in the Soviet Union, if you know about this, where Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union, the communists, basically arrested people that were against the regime and either killed them or they sent them to the Gulag. You know about that. It's kind of the same thing that happened in France. But in this case, what happened was they started arresting, imprisoning people, and they also eventually went on to execute people also as well. In the thousands, like 30, 40,000 or more may have been executed at one point. It was all controlled for a year or so by this committee that was called the Committee of Public Safety. It was like a de facto dictatorship. It had 12 men on it mostly, but it was run by Maximilien Robespierre. He was basically the dictator that was running the country overall. And the Committee of Public Safety went on to massacre and execute thousands of people in the country, just anybody that was against the regime overall. They even massacred clergy. You know about this? Like Catholic priests and so on that they arrested. They killed them all. It's awful. Or forced them out the country, basically. That's one thing that becomes really famous, about the French Revolution, is the French adopt this new way of executing people you've probably heard about, which is the famous guillotine, which I wanted to talk a few minutes about, of course, today. And yeah, the guillotine was this new kind of execution device which decapitated people. They cut your head off, basically, and which would be used during the Revolution to kill thousands, like maybe 40,000. I don't know if they ever figured out how many people were killed with it overall. But part of why it came about wasn't because of the Reign of Terror. It was actually developed because they wanted to find, like doctors, I think, were behind it mostly. They wanted to find more humane ways to execute people, like criminals or whatever. Before that, before they had the guillotine in France or whatever, there were all kinds of methods, the way they executed you. They hanged you, they burned you at the stake, drawn and quartered. Some of these were really awful, executions, and so they wanted to find a more quicker way to use it. This kind of a machine or device has been used in a lot of countries. The French had it, of course, for years up to the 20th century. The Germans did too. The Germans used a variation of it too. That they had. The Germans had one called the Das Fallbeil, which meant in German the falling axe. That's what it meant. And I think even like up to the Nazi regime, I know like under Adolf Hitler, they used a smaller version of it that was one they used inside a room, more or less. Now, the man that developed it and designed it was a man named Dr. Antoine Louis. He actually helped invent it. And actually, he was actually one of the personal physicians of Louis XVI. And Louis XVI was one of the guys that helped design it, with him. Just kind of ironic because it ends up being the method that he gets executed, Louis XVI. So, designed his own device to kill himself, I guess. But it didn't get named after him. I think there was an attempt to like maybe name it after him, like the Luzette or something like that. That wasn't very popular. And they eventually named it after this man named Joseph Guillotine. And Guillotine was a French doctor. And he was one of the men that was a major supporter of it being used to execute people with capital punishment, all that. And so it eventually got named after him. But there were like numerous names that they went through, which I'll show you here. But you can see here that they think it was first used 1792. They do think it was influenced by the Germans. The Germans had a variation of it, I told you, called the falling axe, which used a 45-degree angle blade to execute people. It was first used in 1792. And look at that. It was last used in 1977. That's amazing because, that's the year when Star Wars came out. The movie Star Wars, the original movie. They would use it for a long time, for almost 200 years. Yeah, those are other names. Luzette, Luzatine, Luzon. There's all kinds of different names. I think that think about the Madame Guillotine, I think was another name. I think they had as well. But everybody called it the National Razor. So that was basically the main nickname that they often called it, the National Razor. And just right here. And here's some other stats about it too. It was about 1,300 pounds. So this thing was heavy, really heavy. I think most was made of wood. The blade itself weighed about almost 90 pounds. The actual height of the side post was 14 feet. So it was like around 14 feet tall, these machines, devices. Blade drop was about 90 inches. It fell at a rate, the blade, at about 7 meters or 21 feet per second. That's how fast it came down. Literally, you would miss it. Like if it seriously, it came down that fast. You blinked or you turned your head, the head's already off, like that. It was that fast. So it took about 200ths of a second for the head to be cut off. That fast, pretty quick. Power at impact of the blade was about 888 pounds per square inch. Wow. And they say it, many people, it took a while for them to lose consciousness. So like in many cases, they saw their reflexes, if you know about this. And so their eyes keep blinking and maybe hands and stuff like that still moving, afterwards. Something that was quite common. But quite often, they had a basket in front, you see there, to catch the head. Because if they didn't have a basket there, it would probably fly off, and all that. So it became a spectacle when they executed people. Like thousands of people would watch people, being executed, and they'd go crazy, when they would show the head, all that. Who were some famous people executed by the guillotine? I kind of go through that a little bit. Of course, Louis XVI might have been the most famous. He was executed in January 1793 after a treason trial against him. So he was the first. His wife was executed 10 months later. October of 1793. There's a famous incident where, I don't know if you heard the story about this, but there's a famous incident where she went up to be executed on the scaffold. And before she got executed, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. It's like, oops. And you know what she said? She said, "Excuse me, I didn't do it on purpose." And that was her last words, Marie Antoinette. Maximilian Robespierre also was famous. He was executed in July of 1794. He also had said some kind of last word too, as well, which was, what was it? He said, "Merci, monsieur," which meant, "Thank you, mister," before he got executed. It's kind of a strange thing to say, I guess. Another, they say that, I'll mention a little bit about this story, which is kind of an interesting story you may have heard about. You ever heard about Jean-Paul Marat? He's very famously associated with the French Revolution. Marat was a pro-Jacobin supporter, and he had this newspaper that he had that was called The Friend of the People. There's the French name too, as well. It was a radical newspaper, and it had all kinds of stuff in it where they would incite violence, mob violence and things like that. There was one case where he had a quote where he said something like you see there, where he said, in order to ensure public tranquility, 200,000 heads must be cut off. Well, people that are against the revolution and all this. And apparently he was stabbed to death. You know about this, in his bathtub by this pro-Girondist woman named Charlotte Corday, who didn't really like the more radical Montagnards. And of course, Jacques Louis David made a famous painting about it that was known as The Death of Marat. And Marat, by the way, became a big martyr of the Jacobins after he was killed. They think Marat's death is what led to the trial and execution of Marie Antoinette, who was executed a few months later because of him. That's Jean-Paul Marat. But you can see how radical the whole thing starts going with the revolution. Other things that they did too with the revolution that were really wacky as well, which you can see here. They also did away, believe it or not, with Christianity. They went really crazy with this. And they call it the so-called Republic of Virtue, all these crazy reforms that Robespierre, the Jacobins did. They started de-Christianizing the whole country. They closed down all the monasteries. They closed down all the churches. They basically got rid of Catholicism. They kind of almost banned it practically in the country. And then what they did was they replaced it with a deist cult that became known as different names. I think the common name they called it was the Cult of the Supreme Being, which was around for almost 10 years, from 1793 to 1802. And Robespierre wanted to create this new state religion that would replace Christianity, because I guess it was always associated with the absolutism and the monarchy and all that. And they all wanted to base religion on the Age of Enlightenment and the ideas like that. So these are all crazy ideas that they came up with. Any kind of symbols that had to do with the monarchy, they got rid of them. They tried to get rid of statues of kings and so on. I think there was a case where they cut the heads off statues. Right now they got all these crazy people wanting to tear down statues and all that stuff. That's what they did with the revolution. They started tearing down statues and stuff like that. Face cards. That's for, you playing cards, they got rid of the face cards. The ones with the king, the queen, the joker. You couldn't have those anymore because they didn't want anybody to think that about anything about having a monarchy, or anything like that. I think there was a joke that they replaced the face cards with the symbols of liberty, equality, fraternity. So you're playing Go Fish or something. You got any liberties? You got any qualities? That kind of thing. Sort of. That kind of thing. And then, of course, the other thing they're famous for in the revolution that was really wacky, too. Here's a little slide if you want to read about that. They call it different names. They had a festival that was part of it, the festival of the supreme being, which I think was started on that date. Looks like June 8th every year. But one of the most famous things they did with the French Revolution was they created a new calendar system. It was called different names. It was called either the French Revolutionary or also called the Republican calendar. And it was an anti-Christian calendar, basically based off of like the Enlightenment, and also based off of the weather and seasons. It was very weird. And it had 12 months based on the seasons. They had 10 days a week instead of 7. And so you had 3 weeks in a month. That's crazy. They did. That's what they went to. And they even changed the years. They got rid of the Christian calendar, which is, the Gregorian calendar at the time. And the Gregorian calendar starts, with year one, when around when Jesus was born, right? Jesus Christ was born around close to 1 AD, right, to the present, AD CE, or whatever you want to call it. So they got rid of that, and they went to saying 17. Actually, it should be 92, I think is what it is. Actually, around 93, basically 92, 93. They started with year one, basically year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. Basically, just started over again from scratch. And they did this because they didn't want anybody to know, like, all the Christian dates, like when's Christmas, when's Easter, when's there certain days of certain saints, things like that. So they wanted to get rid of all these things that people wouldn't know anything about, all these Christian dates and so on. And they had the calendar for a long time, for like 13, 14 years, I guess they used it, until Napoleon got rid of it in 1806. They went back to the Gregorian calendar. You can see there on the left that they named all the months after the weather or something like that. So Vendemiaire was like vintage. Brumaire was fog. Frimaire was frost. Nivose was snow. Pluvose was rain. Ventos was wind. Germinal was budding. Florio was flowers. Prairial was meadow. Mesidor was harvest. Thermidor was heat. Fructidor was fruit. So there's kind of crazy names that they came up with. The British made fun of it. They mocked it. They said that autumn was wheezy, sneezy, and freezy. Winter was slippy, drippy, and nippy. Spring was showery, flowery, and bowery. And summer was weedy, heaty, and sweety. So anyway, those are crazy ideas, but they thought they were doing great, with all these new things that were based on the Enlightenment, liberty, equality. Yeah, it does, influence, eventually, people in Europe and other places. But some think that the revolution went too far. The Jacobins just go crazy. And what's going to happen eventually is that, there's going to be a counter-revolution that's going to occur. And basically, the Jacobins are going to get overthrown. They're going to get overthrown. And with their overthrow, the government's going to go back to being more moderate. And then I'll get to it later. I probably won't talk about it today because I'm probably stop here for today. But eventually, they're going to go to more of a moderate type government, which is called the French Directory or Directory. It's called, which will last for only a few years. It's kind of a weak government that the French have. And that's going to allow Napoleon Bonaparte to seize power. I'll get to more later about Napoleon, but Napoleon's going to eventually Napoleon's going to seize power at the end of the French Revolution. And that's going to lead into the so-called Age of Napoleon that you have later, more or less. So I didn't want to go far here, I think, after that, because I wanted to, I think next class I'm going to get more in, next lecture I'm going to get more into like the beginning of the period of Napoleon and all that. So I'll kind of talk about the end of the revolution and the rise of Napoleon in the next lecture next week. And then we'll get probably next week will be mostly, Napoleon, more or less. So before we go, don't forget about a few things, reminders. Don't forget about vocab due, this week. So try to post that to SpeedGrader for me so I can get that up. And Yeah, I think that was due today, I believe, the vocab. And then also you got a bunch of quiz assignments. There's one on the Battle of Naseby, that video quiz. That's due tonight, I know, I think. And then, of course, you've also got that other Canvas quiz I gave you on England, which the British one on the British history, English history. Of course, that is not going to be on our future second exam. So that, it's going to be like a major quiz. I think there's 20 questions on it, I believe, or something like that. So not going to have that on the future second exam. So anyway, before I go, of course, remind you, I am going to put this lecture up later, of course, on my YouTube channel. So I'll post it. And if anybody's got any comments, questions, of course, let me know later, of course, about it. Okay, so that's it for today. Hope you all have a good rest of the week. Hope you have a good weekend and all that. So take care.